Appreciate y'all. All right. First of all, welcome to Austin. And for those of you who have been here for a few days, good luck going back home. There's nothing like this place. I love it. I've lived here for about 9 years, and there's nothing like both the city, the environment, the culture, and the people who live here. So we're very grateful to our city, and I hope you come back later on when South by is not happening, and you'll get to see get a real taste of what Austin is all about. Okay, so my name is AJ Feliciano. I am the general manager of Companion. We are a new brand. We launched last night here at South by Southwest Podcast Movement Evolutions. Thank you so much for all of you who came to our launch event last night. We had a great time. We were definitely over capacity. Wasn't expecting that, so I'm so grateful to everybody out here. So today we are talking about the new town square. So media responsibility. Good morning, everybody. So today I want to talk about something that I think everybody in the room is generally connected to, and it's podcasting's responsibility and what many people are calling an age of division. Now, but the more I research this topic, the more I realize something very interesting. The reality might be just a little bit more complicated than that. Are we really so divided? Not so sure. So today I want to explore three things: whether or not we really are as divided as it seems, and how media, especially podcasting, is evolving. So when you think about podcasting, it's important to sort of think about our medium as not necessarily a medium itself, but rather the evolution of the media industry. So, and what responsibility generally comes with that evolution? And then we're going to open up to a panel with some people who think about these questions from various different angles. All right, so a quick breakdown of what this session actually looks like. We're going to first start with the so-called age of division. Secondly, the evolution of media and the creator economy. And then third, who media actually reaches today. And finally, the big question: what responsibility does this industry actually have? So let's kick things off. Let's look at a little research. America is so deeply divided. 80% of us feel that we're on the wrong track. We're on different sides of the aisle. But is that really clearly the case? We hear this everywhere. We hear it in politics. We hear it in social media. We hear it on television. The narrative is that we're living in a uniquely fractured moment. But when you look deeper into that data, something really interesting starts to emerge. And in fact, Axios, who actually was originally supposed to be part of the panel here today, published a really interesting piece just a few days ago about, is there possibly a disparity between perception and reality of how deeply divided we actually are. So they took a look at Pew Research, consistently showing that obviously 80% of Americans say that the country is deeply divided. And they sort of took a thesis that was pretty provocative. The argument was that the country may not nearly be as divided as the media environment makes it appear, because most Americans aren't spending their time arguing on Twitter or cable news panels. They're working, they're raising kids, they're coaching Little League, they're helping their neighbors, they're living their lives, y'all. The piece points out that about 21% of Americans use X and just 10% actually use it daily. And during most primetime hours, get this, less than 1% of Americans are watching cable news. Less than 1% of Americans are watching cable news, and that should surprise many people in the room. So the loudest voices in the conversations often represents a very small slice of the population. So Axios basically summed it up in this way: the system feels broken, but the people are not. The adults are generally fine. They know the difference between right and wrong. They generally have a good foundation of how things in society should function. But then another question sort of emerged from all this, and I started to wonder, are the kids all right? So what's happening to the next generation of consumers? And so for that, we actually have to sort of understand what's actually happening. We need more context. We need to know what's happening in the media industry and how consumption behavior is actually changing. So at the same time, something very real is happening in media. The old system of editorial gatekeepers is declining. We're seeing it all over the news, right? The headline after headline. The most recent headline that I can think of: NBC Universal exits the first-run syndication business on Friday and cites video podcasting as being one of those reasons for that. That is massive news, guys. That is massive news. That's daytime programming, largely supplied by NBC Universal. And because of the shutdown of affiliates, owned and operated stations, we're seeing a massive shift on that front. So With them declining for the most part of the 20th century, we're talking editors, networks, publishers, standards departments. They acted as filters between creators and audiences. Today, that structure is largely dissolving. Talk shows become podcasts, and now you're seeing them getting licensed to Netflix and Hulu and so on, right? They're sort of making their way around. Journalists becoming independent creators. You see a journalist sort of leave the Washington Post and then all of a sudden become a massive independent creator almost overnight, which is incredible. Broadcast becoming streaming, and audiences connecting directly with the voices that they trust. That's the big through line. It's the trust that's actually shifting because of consumer behavior. So in order to understand this more, let's talk a little bit. I'm going to take you back to College 101 for any mass media communications majors out there. So we're gonna strike a note here. Now, if you recall, if you zoom out historically, this moment actually fits a pattern, right? Think about the days when newspapers came around. You think about the radio age when it came around from the 1920s to 1940s, into the television era when TV started to eat radio's lunch, into the internet era, and then right now where we are in the creator podcast era. And that last era right there where the star is, this is more aptly defined as the direct to consumer era. What if I were to tell you that we are not in the podcasting business, folks? We are in the direct to consumer business, right? We own the marketing channels. We have direct control over that content. Now, forgive me. So radio-led, generally when it came to radio and TV, there were things that sort of established those channels. There were guardrails, there were rules, right? Different communications acts, there was legislation, laws that were passed to help regulate the information that we were actually getting served, right? Radio led to the Radio Act and Communications Act. Television brought the Fairness Doctrine and public broadcasting policy, and even protections for kids. And I'm going to asterisk that because we're going to come back to that in just a little bit. The internet, even during that age, we have things like Section 230, right? Which is something that's largely still evolving today, right? Questions being asked of Meta and other platforms. But now in the creator era where podcasts are included, this has grown so incredibly fast that it's hard for regulators or the government or anyone to actually keep track of or take notice, and largely without any shared norms or ethical framework. So is it possible, folks, that podcasting may actually be the first mass medium to achieve this level of cultural influence before actually establishing how we're actually going to use it? Any shared norms around it, right? Any things that we can generally agree on. The other mediums have had it, but we haven't established it for the creator era yet. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. Now, I want you to let's understand a little bit about reach. This is data you've seen before, right? Radio, TV, streaming, podcasts. This is consumption of the general public. My thanks to Sounds Profitable, Tom Webster, for supplying this information. Now, but the headline here is, while this might be the total population and the breakdown of their consumption, take a look at Gen Z and Gen Alpha. It flips. All of their attention is in streaming, podcasts, and the general creator economy world. And look at where TV and radio are. So it would make sense. All the news headlines that you're seeing out there, right? They're seeing this incoming generation come in, this consumer behavior completely changing, and how it's completely shifting to this direct-to-consumer model. Now, this raises very important questions in the way that we actually moderate this. Now, today, let me skip ahead a little bit. So creator-led media obviously dominating, podcasting being part of that ecosystem. The headline that I want you to get from here is, for these audiences, creators aren't just entertainers. Because they're spending so much time consuming this media here on the right side of the chart, they're not just entertainers, they are often interpreters of the world for that next generation. And for that is so especially and critically important in how we actually establish trust and how that actually flows between mediums. Now, another piece of interesting data is about, generally about this, it also comes from Sounds Profitable in their attention and trust report. I recommend that you actually take a look at that. Podcast hosts are trusted more than traditional broadcast messengers, and that typically translates to advertisers and so on. And that's why there's so much interest in this space. But this matters when it comes to the information actually being delivered, because trust and attention go together. They create the influence. This leads to an idea that I thought about a lot is the creator economy may be becoming a new form of civic infrastructure. Now, historically, we're talking radio and TV being institutions, them having networks and internet having platforms that are creating their own sets of regulation around rules and regulation around that. Today, individuals can shape public discourse at a massive scale. And the problem here is that when it's so focused on creators, obviously, fire breeds attention. So, what rules are we going to set around those fires so that we stop going into our individual silos? We are losing some of the very basics that we generally all agreed upon. And luckily for him, he has such wonderful parents that he knows another world, right? He was taught right from wrong. And so, what is our responsibility in that discourse? So, that's what we're here to talk about today, right? Why responsibility matters. And here's where the responsibility conversation actually comes in, because younger audiences are forming their worldviews inside this media environment. Creators can become trusted authorities, and they are. High attention, high trust media can shape how people interpret culture, politics, and identity. And so the question becomes, is there a foundation of truth, or let's call it values, that we can all agree on as an organization, as an industry? And so some questions here, you know, we know that there's generally something inherently wrong with the discourse out there, and I imagine that everybody in here, as publishers, as networks, as different people across this industry, that we want to have impact. We want to have so the conversation that perhaps we should be having is, obviously regulation is complicated, and platforms have their own set of rules, and government regulation raises serious concerns. We want to have our freedoms here, but maybe there's another approach. Maybe this industry needs to start talking about a podcast code of ethics. Other mediums have it. Why can't we? Right? We have our own standards. We talk about them amongst one another. Why don't we formalize that sort of thing? Maybe this industry needs to talk about that. Not regulation, but shared norms. Things like transparency and sponsorship, clear separation between news and opinion, standards for correcting misinformation, protections for younger audiences. The question isn't what government should do. The question should really be, what are we willing to hold ourselves accountable to as an industry? And so with that, perfect. I've got good time here. I'd love to welcome now our panel conversation. So coming up to the stage right now, we have here people who represent three very different perspectives to the industry. Please welcome to the stage Ford Bowers, Courtney O'Connor, and Jordan Levin. All right, so quick bios on our guests here, starting with Ford Bowers. Ford is the president of Companion. As president of Companion, Ford Bowers leads the company's creative vision and oversees its day-to-day operations. He has produced documentary films and a range of podcasts aligned with the company's mission, reaching millions of viewers and listeners across platforms. Among those projects are Soul Boom with Rainn Wilson, Companion's flagship original podcast, and also 13 other shows that we were able to announce last night. And then here we have Courtney O'Connor, who I've known for a very long time, director of podcast media at Oxford Road. Courtney joined the agency in 2018 and worked her way up from media coordinator to director of podcast media. Today, she leads one of the largest performance podcast media buying teams in the industry, overseeing new business strategy, client growth, and a team responsible for planning, negotiating, and optimizing campaigns at scale. Her work sits at the intersection of brands and creators, bringing them together through thoughtful strategy, performance rigor, strong vendor relationship management. Oh, and then finally, Courtney believes relationship capital is a competitive advantage in podcasting, and she's focused on building long-term partnerships with networks and creators that unlock better access, smarter testing, and stronger outcomes for clients. Thank you for being here. And then finally, Jordan Levin, who I've known for a very, very long time, is a professor of practice at UT Austin here in obviously Austin, Texas. Longtime media executive across television and digital. Jordan is a veteran media executive. We're very lucky to have him here today. Producer, entrepreneur. His career spans more than 3 decades, shaping some of the most influential brands in entertainment. He was a founding executive of the WB television network and later its CEO, the youngest CEO in broadcast history up until that point. Or still. Has anyone broken your record? No, probably not. We're gonna hold to it. Now you're gonna love this part. He helped build a defining slate of series, including Dawson's Creek, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Gilmore Girls, and Smallville, while establishing one of the television's most successful youth-focused networks. Over the years, he has led major organizations across evolving media landscape, including GM of Xbox Entertainment Studios at Microsoft, NFL's first chief content officer, CEO of Awesomeness TV, and general manager of Rooster Teeth at Warner Brothers Discovery here in Austin. His work is consistently focused on pioneering new models for storytelling, fan engagement, and cross platform content. And today, Jordan is helping educate the next generation and knows this subject matter quite well, working at UT Austin's Moody College School of Communication. So, thank you so much again for being here. We're going to kick off our panel. Now, the general theme of today is if podcasting is a new town square, what responsibility does our industry have to society? So I'm going to start with Jordan. You've spent decades inside traditional media and digital media. When you look at podcasting and the creator economy today, what feels familiar? What feels fundamentally different?
Well, I think you set the table really, well, AJ. And if you go back to that chart that you were referencing, those different eras, you know, I, I think you got to recognize that the metrics or the goalposts have moved pretty significantly. Um, and that radio and television era, as you said, that was an era when, uh, the focus was very much on reach. And that was because of limitations of what kind of data could get generated to determine who was watching or listening, right? So the earliest era, you're reaching mass audiences. It's all about reach. Then you get into sort of the cable era, I would guess, is the best way of describing it. And you start to get more data that defines audiences demographically. Once you start uh, getting to that stage, you start to see deeper penetration on a narrower front, but still at some relative degree of scale, and it's still impression based. What you call the internet age, the early digital age, you start to see this shift towards engagement as compared to reach. I think the early days of the internet, for those of us who were there, it was a lot of smoke and mirrors. It was based on impressions. The numbers were extraordinary. They didn't make any sense. And so this push towards engagement happens, which is where we find ourselves now, deeper and deeper penetration on a narrower and narrower front, and people getting paid largely two ways, either direct to consumer in the form of subscription or patronage, or through advertising. And the advertising rewards engagement and rewards action. And that rewards, I think, behavior that is intense, but is not necessarily reflective of the whole of who is listening or watching. And I think podcasting gets very amplified because in social media, that impression based uh, revenue, advertising isn't very significant. It isn't very rewarding. Where you start to be able to see some money is in podcasting, where you start to get into DR advertising that's very much based on people responding to a code or a call to action. Uh, and again, that podcasting then starts to shift to that relate or debate dynamic to try and attract people. And so the question really becomes, where are we now versus where were we then, as you said. And I think it still is all about what incentivizes uh, people to be rewarded uh, from an economic standpoint and an economic basis. And we're very much in a place right now where inciting passion is what is driving the underlying economics of the industry.
And speaking of inciting passion, we had a lot of passionate fangoers here last night over the general premise of what we were trying to build with Companion. Jordan, I think you bring up a great point, especially about how, you know, although the data is getting better over time, right? Brands are seeing a lot more sort of interest in jumping in podcasting because there's also a familiarity with it that comes from the TV world, right? Podcasting has that always on nature to it, right? Weekly aspect to it. We're sort of going back to the old days of when, you saw those TV infomercials. We interrupt this break to give you an endorsement for whatever, right? Um, I wonder about actually, let me actually switch to Courtney for a second. Let's talk about the brands for a second and the advertisers that generally fund this ecosystem. Should advertisers think about the societal impact of the media they support?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I'm a kid of the digital age. I have grown up with social media and now podcasting, and I'm actually someone that isn't super into traditional media. I consume all of my media content on podcasts. So speaking for myself, and when I hear an advertiser supporting my favorite show, I don't think, "Ooh, that advertiser believes every single thing that that podcaster is talking about." But advertisers love podcasting and love the space, one, because it's an opt-in channel. The people that are listening to that content are listening to the content because they've chosen to be there. It's not being fed to them when they're in the car on the radio. It's not being served to them on an algorithm on social media. You're intentionally going to your listening app to opt in to listen to that content. And so I think that's a really special thing about podcast, and the trust that those creators are building with their audiences is also then obviously turning to ROI for our brands that are running. So I think I don't think I answered your question at all, but I think it toes a line a little bit of, sure, are you supporting the content, but also you're reaching the listeners that want to hear that content, you know?
Do you think the general audience understands the division between the brand message and the creator that they're supporting? And actually, you know what? Let me ask a different question because I know we're a little pressed for time. Because I wonder do you see any difference today versus yesterday when it comes to brands getting involved with creators? And Ford, I'm going to go to you next after this question. Um, so is it more about, do you see alignment with the creator taking place more today than yesterday, or no difference in the matter?
Things have really changed. This industry has changed a lot. And I think that, when we look back 5 years, we were in the middle of a global pandemic. We were in like a very hairy situation where everyone was really scared to talk about polarizing topics. And that made advertisers really scared because they didn't know what they were aligning with. And they really dove into being extremely safe with what they were advertising on. News and politics advertising for DR sponsors went down. News and politics is one of the best performing genres for a DR advertiser. That is such a tuned in audience. I actually just looked. Oxford Road is publishing Orbit, and so that is our proprietary data set of the billions of dollars that we have spent in advertising. And the first set that we put out of 15 shows, 20% of those top performing shows were in news and politics. And so it's crazy because 5 years ago, brands wouldn't touch it. Now, brands are interested in running in news and politics and in comedy and all of that, as long as we always say as an agency, support both sides. Don't pick one or the other to align with. If the demographics work on both ends, choose both sides. So I actually think we're getting a little bit more flexible because, like you said, podcast is turning into the late night hosts and it's turning into the talk shows because it's a little less censored. It's a little less politically driven, maybe by a large corporations. And advertisers are saying that too.
That's really interesting. So you're saying that brand alignment isn't as relevant as we generally think, and especially when it comes to political content, that stuff is generally high reward, but it's also likely also high risk in some cases.
Yes, sometimes.
Yes. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you so much. Ford, going to you. All right. So we're talking about how creators in podcasting and also sort of making their way to traditional mediums. I want to talk a little bit about the genesis of the companion and where you sort of see where the discourse is in America today, and how do you see what you're building as generally reflective of that discourse and what you're like looking to do? I think the increased polarization and at the same time increased connection that we're seeing on unprecedented levels is a very well-traversed topic and that we all understand fundamentally. I think this conversation has been really insightful because the broader theme is, where does responsibility lie for the state of our culture and the state of our discourse? I remember, like, when we were growing up, so much of the scapegoating was placed on Hollywood. They'd say, oh, well, people perceive that part of the world because of the way Hollywood portrays it. Or, the youth these days, they're morally corrupted because of Hollywood glorifying violence and sex. And now the scapegoating can shift a little bit to the tools of the digital era, right? And say, well, because the platforms push this algorithm, or because they want you addicted to a feedback loop and all this stuff. What's well traversed is this notion that the internet age is a bit like the discovery of fire. It's at once this thing of extraordinary potential and at the same time of tremendous destruction. And is it the tool itself, or is it the wielder of that tool that's the thing that really has that potential and really has that capability for damage? So I think as we're talking about like where the responsibility lies for the state of our culture, I would be discouraged if we started to sort of scapegoat like the tools of our era and start to think about like what fundamentally shapes the character of a society. And should we say that it's a top down approach? Like, do we really want to buy into the idea that, well, these few institutions and what they're putting out in the world are what is creating the status of our society? I think everyone should feel some level of accountability for what they're putting out in the world, down to the personal level, up to the macro industrial level. Of course, influencers, brands, creators, of course, everyone should feel some level of accountability. But to sort of address, like, I think what's being asked of Jordan and of Courtney, I don't think, it's the brands or the creators who are going to really shape the character of our world or of ourselves, right? The consumer habits, as you were mentioning earlier, that are sort of shifting everything to DTC. Well, now you're sort of seeing the industry react, right? So what is the thing that's truly proactive? Like, what's the thing that's truly procreative? And so I think really what you're going to see is, as society undergoes its own process of maturation and its appetites change, well, then what the consumer's reward will be different. And the kind of content that they're engaging with will change. And then the brands, as to Courtney's point, will follow what's successful with their audiences. So ultimately, I don't think you should place it from a top-down worldview. I think lasting fundamental change always sort of happens at a grassroots level.
Absolutely. Do you think that there is a mild form of responsibility, though? Like, or do you think from at
Oh,
least from the
yeah.
top down, like, would you be on board with like some sort of code of ethics, or rather some sort of standards that are at least like communicated, but not
Yeah.
necessarily like enforced or something?
No, that's a really good point. This is something that we reflect on a lot at Companion, because we want to be those who are sort of wielding that fire to sort of help uplift the social discourse, right? Um, and what you're talking about in terms of like adhering to some sort of code of ethics is something that we've meditated on specifically, because on the one hand, we have to respect creator freedom. Like, that's something that's non-negotiable. We don't look at rough cuts. We don't intervene on our creators and really truly any way. At the same time, as a network, we also have to feel some sort of responsibility for what we're platforming. To say, well, whatever they say and we have zero complicity with it, is just kind of negligent or apathetic. So then how do you navigate that if you want to insist on the creators having the editorial liberty, but you also want to have some sort of feeling of responsibility? And what you can do is you can agree from the outset on a conceptual framework for what kind of discourse you're here to create in a truly natural way, like in a truly supremely voluntary way. Say, is this a good match? Like, do we share the same values? Because if we can agree, okay, we're here to strive for greater meaning in society and the pursuit of truth, and we're not here to create derision, we're not here to be hateful. If we can agree that these are our code of ethics, then anything within that framework is sort of like your plotted garden that you're here to flower in any way that you choose. And once we sort of establish, okay, this is a good match, then we understand what we're supporting.
That's great. Establishing early on through conversation what you're all about so that they know, generally where you're operating, but you're not necessarily dictating it. Let's turn our attention to the audience now. Jordan, you're teaching, the youth of tomorrow on a daily basis. Are the kids all right? What's going on out there, anecdotally speaking?
That's such a loaded question, and something obviously we're not going to answer in a very brief period of time, but I would say yes and no. I mean, they're incredibly self-aware. They're also very addicted to the way that they consume and their devices, and they know it. And they're trying to break that addiction in some ways and really struggling to figure out how to be empowered to do it, how to have agency to do it, both in terms of the devices and what they consume. They are very comfortable sort of in their screens, in their world, the real life connectivity, just assigning group assignments creates some anxiety, and I think trying to trust a community not hidden behind the veil of anonymity online, as well as trying to figure out what information to trust, especially as they get more and more information from AI. And a lot of that information isn't correct. It's a mixed bag. They have all the information in the world. They're young. They lack context. They lack framing, and they're trying to figure out what values are important. They obviously want to be connected and be a part of something, but what that is and how that takes shape and how that takes form is challenging. And they're very, very influenced, obviously, by the information they receive through the channels that they engage with, which is largely TikTok as top of funnel, YouTube to some degree, and then ultimately driven into podcasting.
Do you think that are there any other concerns though in your mind, or maybe we shouldn't be concerned at all? Like, do you feel like they have a good understanding of what's generally right from what's wrong? Like, I'm thinking about, so I'm a father. I have 7 and 5 year old. We try to teach them what's right from wrong, and I think that there are certain things that society has generally agreed upon. Right? Racism is bad. Sexism is bad. Sometimes we're watching TV and just like, gosh, I'm now starting to question everything that we sort of made forward momentum on. And am I wrong here? What's going on? What's going on out there? Do you see anything in sort of the foundation there that makes you wonder, maybe we maybe we'll be all right? I don't know.
Well, I think like most consumers, you're increasingly in a bit of an echo chamber of your own making, and they're heavily influenced. So everything I'm going to say is a broad generalization, but their information is very limited to what they get exposed to. And in that way, we just have a different sort of set of gatekeepers emerging, in my opinion, from what used to be very traditional gatekeepers.
Do you think that they're particular adept at a sort of figuring out what's truth from fiction? I think there's data to support actually like the older audiences that at least that are newer to certain mediums that they find some difficulty figuring out really discerning what's fake news and what's not, right? That's why there's all this scam happening out there. But do you think younger audiences are more just tuned in to sort of do their research or figure out what's generally real?
I think that they are more media educated. Their media literacy is higher than a generation, but the sources of that information that they're sourcing a lot of times speak in a very informed way, again, without that backing that you might find a traditional journalist to have or an expert in the field to have. I think, we obviously live in a very transactional culture. A lot of people are trying to put themselves out there as experts in a field. And in many cases, I think they respond to whoever's sort of shouting the loudest at any given moment and trying to figure out who to trust and how to trust that source.
I appreciate you. I threw you some curveballs, but Jordan is particularly like really knowledgeable on this front, and I appreciate his insight here. So I'm gonna just some rapid fire questions here. Ford, No, excuse me. What responsibility does each of these stakeholders have? Ford, what is the responsibility of creators?
I think all of us creators especially should be in a pattern of an action and reflection on their behavior. So everyone should be thinking deeply about what it is that they're injecting into the culture. Last night we had Penn Badgley here, and he was this is something he and I have had like long, Penn too. You guys are old friends. Yeah, me too. We have like slumber parties where we stay up late in the night talking about this because he feels very conflicted about some of the projects that he has also participated in. And he reminded me about how, and he mentioned this last night. We use the word culture in a scientific context to describe like the environment within a petri dish. Like we would describe that as a culture. And if you introduce one thing toxic to it, it affects all of the cells eventually, right? And the same thing for if you're infecting something has a healing capacity. So if you have a microphone, of course you should be thinking deeply about what are the consequences personally and societal, socially, for what it is that you're introducing to the culture. Um, I think everyone on that list that you're about to share has to be in that same state of reflection and action. But that's why I say zooming out. My belief is that ultimately, no matter what they say in the microphone, it will resonate or it won't, depending on the character of the society that they're speaking to. So if you go down to the very bottom of the funnel, like that's where it will lead you. Like the actual root of the state of our culture and our discourse lies with us, the people, and not with a creator. Even though, of course, yes, creators should be thinking seriously about what influence they have on others.
That's great. Thank you so much. So, and you gave also your opinion on what responsibility networks do through alignment in what you were saying much earlier. So let me switch over to advertisers. Courtney, what responsibility do you think advertisers have when it comes to media responsibility?
I think that advertisers need to know what their brand ethos is. It's really important, and we do a lot of work digging in on like what do they believe in, what do they want to align with. Like you were saying, brand suitability, like that does play a factor. But I also think on the flip side, advertisers need to make sure that they're not misusing the trust that the creator has built. And we're a trust-based ecosystem. And so that is what comes to mind for me of making sure that we are not misusing that and putting out a message that doesn't actually align with either what that audience believes or what the brand ethos is.
And that also falls on the creator, right? It's like when something is asked of them, does this fit within the guardrails of the trust that I've established with my audience? So it's sort of a twofer there. And then finally, platforms. Jordan, what do you feel the responsibility should be from the platform side?
Well, the technology platforms take this position that they're not media companies in a lot of ways. And I would argue they are because they're transacting advertising dollars or they're transacting some form of subscription or patronage. And in a lot of ways, their algorithms and how content gets surfaced is very much dependent on their practice. And I do think they have an obligation in a lot of ways, but we've seen their
Mostly to
response
shareholders,
to
but
that.
go on. Messing around.
I mean, to your earlier point about younger audiences, you also, I think, have to keep in the context that there were a lot of other institutions that were influential in the past that have lost influence in younger people's lives, whether that's religion and spirituality in places of worship, whether that's government, whether that's, again, traditional forms of media. The influence of the ecosystem in which they're getting content and information is probably greater now, and less balanced against other influences than in the past. And so those technology companies, that have these platforms, in my opinion, do have a responsibility, and they're certainly making a lot of money off of it.
Thank you so much for that. And so last question here, actually. Actually, no, just two more questions. Should the industry adopt a code of ethics? Or should it just be beholden on the creator? Should that sort of information be published anywhere? Should we adopt as an industry a general standard of how we operate and what we support? Does anybody want to take that question?
It's such a challenging one. I mean, I I think it's very hard to impose a top-down mandate.
Yeah,
I
to
think that
force
has
one.
to come from the bottom. I mean, that video clip you showed, that was from CBS, right? That was replayed on social. So I think somewhere within CBS, there's still this sense that there's this responsibility to do certain stories like that on balance with other stories. Does that will exist? And is there leadership that exists to try to say, maybe not there's a clear set of rules with punishment, but there is a sense of what we should try to strive for and be mindful of and recognize the inherent influence that we have. I think that's the kind of sort of soft power that can get deployed that feels very absent in this era that used to exist in some prior eras.
Thank you.
I would say, like I said, everyone has the responsibility to behave ethically. And how those ethics become universal is something that is progressive but certain.
Thank you so much for all that. Final question for you guys. Where's the light? What trends do you see in the direct-to-consumer environment that give hope for the entire media business and its cultural impact? That's a big question.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that. I think that your stat that you started with, that there isn't actually as much public discourse as we think that there is, or perceptionally there is. I think that's the light. I was at a panel yesterday and Tim Ferriss was saying that less than 1% of human beings consume news every day, and you're led to believe that they're consuming it 99% of the time. So I think that's the light.
Go ahead. No, I think it's a lot of what you showed, in that Axios article. I mean, I do think it's not getting lost in the echo chamber, not getting lost in the noise, but really looking at who is consuming what, as well as the fact that we do have an ecosystem now that allows for greater diversity of voice, and so to some degree, consumption does matter, not simply in levels of engagement, with that consumption. I don't think most people that consume automatically comment, automatically share. And so that has to be worth something as well.
I also think the community base of what podcasting is also really, really important, of the conversations that we now get to have and these like friendships and communities that we get to build. That's also a light, because it's something that maybe we were lacking for a really long time, and podcasting has given that.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a two-way street now. It used to, you just were on the receiving end in the past.
It's a conversation, ultimately, at the end of the day, community building. Ford, were you going to say something?
No, please.
All right. Well, I think that's basically it. Thank you so much for taking the time with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please, a round of applause. My thanks to our panelists, Ford Bowers, Jordan Levin, Courtney O'Connor. And closing message. If podcasting is a new town square, we are the architects of public discourse. Know your responsibility. Thank you so much.